4 XX responses are final responses for the respective requests. If a client doesn't change or modify the request, the result will be the same. 400 bad request, for example, means that the syntax of the request is incorrect. The request is either missing a required piece of data or it is malformed. The response may also include a reason phrase that explains the situation more. For example, missing via header field. Sending this request to the server without making any changes will result in the same response. You may recall from RFC 3261 Simplified Series Part 2 that 6 header fields are mandatory: from, to, call ID, via, C-sequence, and max forwards. Naturally, as an example, if Tarzan calls Jane but his SIP phone, for some reason, does not include one of these 6 header fields in the invite message, he could get 400 bad request response back. 401 unauthorized indicates that the caller is required to authenticate with the server, and either the caller hasn't done that yet or the caller provided wrong authentication. An important point to note here is that 401 unauthorized is a response from the user agent server or a registrar. SIP proxies do not respond with 401 unauthorized. The exact same principle applies to scenarios where the response is coming from a SIP proxy instead of a server, and the response in the scenarios would be 407 proxy authentication required. In both cases, UAC should retry the request with proper credentials to proceed. Well, when we first registered Tarzan's SIP phone in RFC 3261 Simplified Series Part 1, our initial register message did not have any authentication related header field. The registrar required authentication, therefore Tarzan's SIP phone received 401 unauthorized with www-authenticate header field, providing certain data to be used in the calculation of expected authentication value. Note that this response came from the registrar that co-resided with the SIP proxy and not from the SIP proxy itself. Tarzan's SIP phone then used the data in the www-authenticate header field and its password to calculate a value to use in the repeated register message as a part of the authorization header field. 402 payment required. This means the call cannot be completed until a payment is made. Well, let's say they deployed phone booths with SIP phones around the jungle, and they are all going over a SIP proxy that is configured to bill the callers. If Tarzan was using one of those SIP phones in the jungle and calling Jane, SIP proxy could respond with a 402 payment required before processing his call. 403 forbidden indicates that the server understood the request, but it is not going to allow it. There are different instances where the caller could end up with 403 forbidden responses. For example, let's say Tarzan is using a very old version of a SIP phone and the administrators of the SIP environment only allow recent versions due to, let's say, security flaws found in the older versions. If Tarzan tries to register his SIP phone, he may end up with 403 forbidden, with possibly explaining the situation with a warning or error line that says you are currently not using the recommended version of the client. Another common use is to avoid toll fraud and/or limit users. For example, let's say Tarzan wants to call Jane, and Jane is out of the country visiting her parents. If the administrators of the SIP environment configure the system so that locals like Tarzan can only make local calls, Tarzan's international call attempt may get 403 forbidden response. Next is 404 not found. Confusingly similar to 410 gone response, this response indicates that the server cannot locate the called party. With 404 not found, the server doesn't claim that it was at some point able to locate the called party. And it also doesn't claim that this is a permanent situation, that the called party will never be available via this server. 410 gone, on the other hand, indicates that the server was able to locate the called party in the past, but the called party is not and will never be reachable going forward via this server. Therefore, the situation is permanent. A cancelled phone service could, for example, result in a 410 gone response. Before moving on to other responses, it is worth taking a minute to get a little familiar with accept, allow, require, and supported SIP header fields. First of all, while we know what a method is, for example, register, invite, ACK, buy, cancel options, we should also know that there have been additional features admitted into the session initiation protocol under the name extensions. For example, 100 rel and replaces. Only the extensions defined in RFCs are considered standard, and only those extensions should be used. With this in mind, a user agent client may add a header field called allow to list the methods it will be able to apply, and the header field called supported to list the extensions it will be able to apply. Again, the allow header field is used to list the methods, whereas the supported header field is used to list the extensions a user agent client will be able to apply. Here you can see an allow header field example and a supported header field example. Now, if the user agent client has to have an extension applied to the communication, in other words, if the user agent client must apply a specific extension for the communication to succeed, a require header field would be used instead of supported header field. If the user agent server doesn't support all of the extensions indicated in the require header field, the session will not be established, and the user agent server will reply with a response explaining which extension is the reason behind this failure. For example, if replaces and 100 rel extensions are mandatory for the communication to succeed in this scenario, the user agent client would add the following header field: require, column, replaces, comma, 100 rel. As for the accept header field, just for now, let's say a SIP message with a message body section could use the first set of header fields you see here: content type, content encoding, content language, to define the message body, and the second set of header fields, accept, accept encoding, accept language, to indicate which message body structures are accepted. Now, going back to the 4XX responses, 405 method not allowed indicates that the method in the request line is understood but not allowed by the UAS. This response must include an allow header field listing the methods that the UAS allows so that the client can make a decision accordingly. As an example, let's say Jane's SIP phone does not support refer messages, but Tarzan's SIP phone does, and let's say they are on a call in which the methods both sides allow haven't been disclosed during the session establishment. If Tarzan at this point sends a refer message to Jane, he could receive a 405 method not allowed response with an allow header field that looks similar to the following. And note that refer is not a part of this list. Allow, column, ACK, by, cancel invite. 406 not acceptable. This means the user agent client send a request with an accept header field that lists the content type the user agent client understands, and the user agent server understands none of them. Using the accept header field we used as an example, let's say Tarzan sends an invite message to Jane with the following accept header field. Accept, column, application STP, application ISUP, application DTMF, and let's say Jane's phone only understands application/DTMF-relay content type. In this case, Jane would respond with a 406 not acceptable to Tarzan. 408 request timeout. If there is an expires header field in the request the UAS received and the UAS could not provide the response until the time given in the expires header field has passed, the UAS will respond with 408 request timeout. The UAC can retry the same request at a later time and have a different result as the circumstances could change. 413 request entity too large indicates that the request has a message body that is too large for the server. This could be a temporary situation. As a result, the response could also have a retry after header field to indicate when to retry, or a permanent situation. The user agent client could use a smaller message body, remove message body from the request altogether, or try the same request later. As an example, let's say Tarzan tries to call Jane and it is New Year's Eve, so everyone is calling each other and the SIP proxy serving Jane's camp is overwhelmed. The SIP proxy could respond to Tarzan's request with a 413 request entity too large if Tarzan's request is larger than some other requests. After the overwhelming situation ends, Tarzan's request can be processed without any issues. 414 request URI too long indicates that the server is not going to accept the URI as it is longer than it allows. Well, perhaps Tarzan could call Jane and instead of dialing Jane's URI with IP version 4 IP address, he dials Jane's URI with an IP version 6 IP address, which is of course way longer than IP version 4 IP addresses. In this case, the URI in the request line would be much longer than usual, and the server could respond with a 414 request URI too long. 415 unsupported media type. This is basically telling the user agent client that the server does not support the format used in the message body. Depending on the problem, the response must include accept encoding, or accept language header fields to let the user agent client know what the server supports. Earlier we talked about 406 not acceptable and used a scenario between Tarzan and Jane. Let's use a very similar scenario and let's say Tarzan sends an invite message to Jane with the following content type header field. Content type application STP. And let's say Jane's phone only understands application DTMF relay content type. In this case, Jane would respond with a 415 unsupported media type to Tarzan and have the following accept header field in the response. Accept column application DTMF relay. 416 unsupported URI scheme. indicates that the user agent server does not understand the URI scheme used. As an example, if Jane's SIP phone does not support secure SIP, and yet Tarzan uses SIPs as a part of Jane's URI, Jane's phone could respond with 416 unsupported URI scheme. In this case, Tarzan's phone should retry the call with SIP instead of SIPs. 420 bad extension. An extension listed in the required header field of the request is not supported by the UAS. This response must include an unsupported header field listing the extensions that resulted in this response. User agent client should now retry the request without the extensions called out by the unsupported header field. A simple example would be Tarzan calling Jane with an invite request that has the following required header field: require replaces 100 rel, and Jane's SIM phone not supporting one or more of these extensions listed. In this case, Jane's SIP phone would respond with 420 bad extension and list the extension that caused this response in the unsupported header field. 421 extension required indicates that the user agent server requires an extension that was not listed in the supported header field. This response should include a required header field listing the extension that the user agent server requires to process the request. However, it is recommended in RFC 3261 that, if possible, the user agent server should try to process the request with whatever extensions are available, instead of responding with 421 extension required. Well, let's say Tarzan calls Jane with an invite request that has a supported header field with only extension replaces listed. If Jane's SIP phone must have 100 rel extension to properly process the call, it is recommended that Jane's SIP phone first tries to process the call without 100 rel. If it is impossible to process the call without 100 rel, then Jane's SIP phone should respond with 421 extension required and have a required header field that lists extension 100 rel. 423 interval too brief. This is basically the user agent server rejecting the request because the expiration time of the requested resource is too short for the user agent server. An example to this response would be Tarzan starting up his SIP phone, trying to register to a registrar, and using an expires header field with a value lower than the registrar is configured to allow. In this case, the registrar would respond with 432 interval too brief, and it would be expected from the user agent client to increase the expires header field value to an acceptable level before trying the attempt again. 480 temporarily unavailable indicates that the user agent server was contacted, it was reachable, but the called party was not available. This response could include a retry after header field to suggest a time for another attempt to reach the called party. It is recommended that the user agent server tries to use more explanatory responses like 486 used here if possible. Well, if Jane has a Do Not Disturb feature enabled for her SIP phone and Tarzan calls her, Jane's SIP phone could respond with a 480 temporarily unavailable. 481 call transaction does not exist is an indication that the user agent server received the request, but the request doesn't belong to any active call or dialogue. A simple example here would be Jane's SIP phone receiving an unexpected request like buy when there is no active call. In this case, Jane's SIP phone would respond with 481 call transaction does not exist. 482 loop detected. Naturally, this response indicates that there is a loop in the environment. Let's say Tarzan calls Jane. If Tarzan's SIP proxy is sending this call to Jane's SIP proxy, and instead of sending it over to Jane, Jane's SIP proxy is sending the call back to Tarzan's SIP proxy, that would be a loop. Tarzan's SIP proxy should recognize the fact that its own via entry is already in the request and respond with a 482 loop detected. 483 too many hops indicates that an entity on this call path received this request and the max forwards header field value was 0. Unless max forwards header field is set to a value too low, this could be similar to Tarzan calling Jane and the invite request going from one SIP proxy to another, several different proxies, to a degree that max forwards header field value goes down to 0 before the invite request reaches Jane's SIP phone. 484 address incomplete indicates that the URI is not complete. This response could be used in communication with PSTN in overlapped dialing scenarios. Well, let's say Jane is out of the camp, and in order to reach her, Tarzan needs to dial her external number, 10 digits. And the SIP proxies are configured to know that the external numbers are composed of 10 digits. So if Tarzan dials an 8 digit, he may receive a 484 address incomplete response. He would receive the same response if he dialed 9 digits. The call would not be processed until he dialed 10 digits, the proper URI. 485 ambiguous. This response indicates that the URI was ambiguous and it may include possible alternatives as contact header field values. This is obviously a privacy concern if alternatives are presented in this response. In fact, instead of this response, servers are encouraged to use 404 not found. Revisiting the 404 not found example, let's say Tarzan wants to call Jane, but he is a bit dizzy with all the swinging on the trees and types her name as Jean when he makes the call. Well, if there is nobody named Jean in the camp, or the camp servers do not have anywhere else to send this call to, Tarzan may receive 485 ambiguous response with a contact header field listing Jane as a possible alternative to unknown called party Jean. 486 busy here indicates that the request was delivered to the called party successfully, but the called party is not able to take additional calls at the moment. This response may include a retry after header field to tell the UAC to retry after a certain period of time. Obviously, if Jane is on a call and she has no voicemail coverage, when Tarzan calls Jane, he may receive a 486 busy here response. 487 request terminated is a response indicating that the request being processed has been terminated by a buy or cancel request. Let's say Tarzan calls Jane, but he is in a hurry. Jane's phone rings once, and before she could answer the call, Tarzan hangs up. In this scenario, Tarzan's SIP phone would send a cancel request and receive a 200 OK response followed by a 487 request terminated response. 488 not acceptable here indicates that the specific destination resource, the endpoint, does not accept the session proposal. Other endpoints may accept this request, but this specific one does not. Perhaps Jane is using a Cisco SIP phone and it is not very compatible with the Avaya SIP phone Tarzan is using. If Tarzan calls Jane and Jane's SIP phone is unable to establish the session, whereas she could use other phones in the camp, this could be a specific issue with the endpoint Jane is using, and Tarzan may receive 488 not acceptable here response. 491 request pending is an indication that the user agent server received a resend request while processing the original. If Tarzan calls Jane, Tarzan's SIP phone sends its SIP proxy an invite request, and for some reason, before receiving a response, Tarzan's SIP phone again sends the same invite request to the SIP proxy. The SIP proxy may respond with 491 request pending, as it is already processing the same request. Without diving into security-related topics that we will be covering in other tutorials, the final 4XX client error, defined in RFC 3261, can be summarized as user agent server receiving a message body that is encrypted, and the user agent server does not have the public key to decrypt it. This response could include the user agent server public key for the user agent client to use to encrypt the message body in a way the user agent server can decrypt.